The lake had always called to me. Not in the poetic sense, not some romantic lure of nature, but something darker. I couldn't explain it, but the thought of its glassy, unnervingly still surface made my skin crawl in equal parts fear and fascination. People around these parts called it Hollow Lake, a body of water so quiet that not even the wind dared disturb it. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the village that once sat at the lake's bottom. Decades ago, they said, the government had flooded the valley to build a dam, drowning everything, the church, the schoolhouse, the homes, beneath hundreds of feet of water. The lake was a tomb, they whispered, and the dead weren't resting. That didn't bother me. At least, that's what I told myself. I was a fisherman. A practical man. And the thought of untapped waters filled with fish too stubborn or stupid to know a lure from a worm was too tempting to resist. So, one cloudless afternoon, I packed my rod, net, and gear, and drove the narrow dirt road that wound its way through the forest and down to Hollow Lake. The air grew heavier the closer I got, the kind of weight you feel in your chest during a thunderstorm. By the time I reached the shore, the silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves. Even the soft lapping of the water against the rocks seemed muted. I shivered despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun. My rowboat creaked as I pushed off into the water, the sound reverberating like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet. The surface of the lake was so still it looked like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the sky with uncanny precision. The oars sliced through it with little resistance, leaving barely a ripple behind. I rowed to the center of the lake, feeling an inexplicable pull to its heart. There, I cast my net for the first time. It sank quickly, disappearing into the murky depths, and I sat back to wait. The minutes dragged on, and though my pulse was steady, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, watching me from the shore. When I'd pulled the net in, it wasn't fish I caught. At first, I thought it was just junk, a broken plate, its edges worn smooth by the water. Then came an old coin, tarnished but still recognizable, bearing a date from the early 1900s. Finally, a splintered piece of wood, carved with ornate patterns, as if it had once been part of a chair or a bed frame. I stared at the items in my hands, unease prickling the back of my neck. These things didn't belong here. They shouldn't have come up with the net. But the more I stared at them, the harder it became to look away. The plate felt warm in my hands, almost alive. The coin seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. I shook off the feeling, tossing the debris into the boat. I cast the net again. This time, it came up heavier, almost too heavy to drag into the boat. My arms burned as I hauled it in, and when I finally did, I froze. It wasn't fish. It wasn't junk. It was a doll. The thing was waterlogged and warped, its porcelain face cracked and streaked with algae. One of its eyes was missing, and its dress was tattered and stained, but its remaining eye, a glossy, painted blue, seemed to stare directly at me. My hands trembled as I unhooked it from the net and dropped it into the boat. That was enough for the day. I rowed back to shore, my heart pounding. The silence seemed deeper now, heavier, as if the lake itself was displeased with me. By the time I reached the shore and dragged the boat onto the rocks, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the ground. I should have left then. Driven back to town, abandoned my gear, and never returned. But something, curiosity, maybe, or sheer stubbornness, kept me there. I set up camp a few yards from the shore, a small fire crackling feebly against the growing darkness. As I sat by the fire, the doll and the other objects seemed to mock me from where they lay in the boat. The blue eye of the doll gleamed in the firelight, almost as if it were alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't help. The first whisper came around midnight. It was faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. A soft, lilting voice calling my name. "Daniel!" I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The voice came again, closer this time, and louder. "Daniel!" I stood, heart hammering, and scanned the darkness around me. The firelight didn't reach far, but I could see enough to know I was alone. Or at least I should have been. The voice came again, and this time it wasn't alone. Multiple voices, overlapping, male and female, old and young. "Daniel! Daniel!" I backed away from the fire, my hands shaking. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin. Then I felt it, icy fingers wrapping around my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm back, but the grip was unrelenting. I stumbled and fell, the world spinning as the firelight flickered and dimmed. The hands were on me now, dozens of them, pulling at my arms, my legs, dragging me toward the water. I clawed at the ground, my nails digging into the dirt, but it was no use. The voices were deafening now, a cacophony of anger and despair. "You took what was ours," they hissed. "You disturbed our rest." The water was freezing as it closed over my head, filling my lungs and muffling the voices. But even beneath the surface, I could still hear them. I opened my eyes and saw them, faces, pale and bloated, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. Their hands gripped me tighter, pulling me deeper, deeper into the lake's black depths. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the doll, floating just above me, its blue eye glinting in the murky water. They found my boat the next morning, drifting near the shore. The net was empty, and the debris I'd pulled from the water was gone. They said I must have fallen in, drowned in the still waters of Hollow Lake. But they didn't hear the voices. And they didn't see the blue eye, watching from beneath the surface. Fishing was supposed to be my escape, a way to forget the grind of daily life. I often drove out to the rocky shore near Blackridge Point, where the waves crashed violently against jagged cliffs. It was a dangerous spot, but the solitude was worth it. That day, the sea seemed hungrier than usual, the wind howling in sharp gusts that carried the salty tang of the water. I'd been casting for hours with nothing to show for it. My bucket sat empty beside me, mocking my efforts. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, and I considered calling it a night. But then, as I began to reel in my line, I felt resistance. Something had snagged the hook. Excitement shot through me. Finally! But as I brought the line closer, my anticipation turned to confusion. It wasn't a fish at all, but a long, pale worm wriggling frantically on the hook. Its body was slick and segmented, with a sickly, iridescent sheen that caught the fading light. It wasn't like any worm I'd ever seen. For one, it was huge, nearly a foot long, and its movements were unnatural, jerky, and almost purposeful. I stared at it, feeling a strange unease settle over me. Part of me wanted to throw it back, but the other part, the fisherman in me, saw an opportunity. This thing was alive, after all, and a live bait that unusual could attract something big. I hooked it back onto my line and cast it into the deep water. The results were immediate. Before I could even settle back on my rock, the line jerked violently, nearly pulling the rod from my hands. I braced myself, reeling with all my strength, and after a struggle, I landed a fish. But it wasn't normal. The creature flopped wildly on the rocks, its silver body glinting in the dim light. At first glance, it seemed like an oversized bass, but then I noticed its eyes. They were too large, too human, bulging grotesquely from its skull. Its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of jagged, almost human-like teeth. A shudder ran through me as I stared at the thing. I should have thrown it back. I know that now. But at the time, my curiosity and greed got the better of me. I tossed the fish into the bucket, wiped my hands on my jeans, and cast the line again. Another bite. Then another. Every fish I pulled up was more horrifying than the last. One had a malformed, gaping mouth that stretched halfway down its body, lined with needle-sharp teeth. Another had patches of translucent skin, its organs pulsing visibly beneath. Some had extra fins, others extra eyes, or even none at all. The bucket was filling quickly, but my stomach churned with every catch. I wasn't sure what I'd stumbled upon, but the unnatural bait seemed to be drawing these abominations from the depths. As I cast a line for what I swore would be the last time, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The waves calmed unnaturally, and the air grew heavy. When the line tugged again, it felt different, stronger, heavier. Whatever was on the other end was massive. I struggled against the pull, muscles burning as I fought to reel it in. The rod bent dangerously, and for a moment I thought it would snap. But then the line slackened, and I began to bring it in, inch by inch. When I finally hauled it onto the rocks, I froze. It wasn't a fish. Not entirely. The thing sprawled on the rocks was a grotesque hybrid of man and sea creature. Its bloated, scaly body shimmered with a slick coating of mucus. Its arms, yes, arms, twitched weakly, webbed fingers clawing at the air. The head was the worst part. It was vaguely humanoid, but the features were distorted, the skin stretched too tight over a misshapen skull. And its eyes, they were black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the last light of day. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have taken what wasn't yours." The voice was guttural, wet, as if the words were bubbling up through thick water. My knees buckled, and I fell backward, scrambling away from the thing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The creature tilted its head, those abyssal eyes fixed on me. "The worm is not for you," it rasped. "It belongs to the depths." I managed to find my voice, though it came out in a shaky whisper. What are you?" Its mouth twisted into something resembling a smile, revealing rows of uneven, jagged teeth. "I am what you have awakened. And I am not alone." As if on cue, the sea began to churn violently. Dark shapes rose in the water, circling the rocks where I stood. The waves crashed higher and higher, drenching me in icy spray. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and backed away from the edge. "You've taken from us," the creature hissed. "Now we will take from you." The dark shapes in the water grew closer, their forms becoming clearer. They were like the creature before me, twisted, unnatural amalgamations of man and sea. Dozens of them, maybe more, emerging from the depths with an unholy grace. I turned and ran. The bucket of fish toppled as I fled, their grotesque forms spilling onto the rocks. I didn't look back. My boots slipped on the wet stones, and I nearly fell several times, but adrenaline kept me upright. The guttural voices rose behind me, a cacophony of rage and hunger. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched and shaking. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As I sped away from Blackridge Point, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The ocean was alive with movement. Shadows writhed beneath the surface, and the waves crashed higher than I'd ever seen. Standing on the rocks where I had been moments before was the creature, watching me with those black, endless eyes. I didn't stop driving until I was miles inland, my heart still pounding in my chest. Even now, weeks later, I can't bring myself to go near the water. The dreams haven't stopped either, dreams of dark, churning seas and monstrous figures rising from the depths. And sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I swear I hear a voice whispering from the darkness. "You shouldn't have taken what wasn't yours." I've always believed there's no better place to clear your head than the open sea. Just you, the waves, and the promise of the unknown. That's why I'd taken my old trawler, the Iron Minnow, out for a solo expedition. I wanted to catch something legendary, something to solidify my name among the ranks of deep-sea fishermen. The night was calm, almost unnervingly so. A thin fog draped over the water, the moon casting an eerie silver glow. My sonar chirped rhythmically, a monotonous comfort as I sipped lukewarm coffee and watched the endless horizon. I was nearly 200 miles offshore, far from any shipping lanes or rescue crews. Just how I liked it. First, the sonar barely registered anything unusual, just a few clusters of fish swimming below. But then, around midnight, it screamed. A long, low wail like the cry of a wounded beast. I stared at the monitor, coffee sloshing in my hand. There, at 3,000 feet, something impossibly large moved. It wasn't a school of fish. It wasn't a whale. It was one solid mass, dark and amorphous on the sonar, and it was alive. I leaned closer, heart pounding, as the sonar's numbers fluctuated wildly. Depth, 2,700 feet. Then 2,600. It was rising. I scrambled to prepare the gear. If I could snag even a piece of this thing, it would be a record-breaking catch. As I hurriedly checked the harpoons and reinforced lines, the iron minnow trembled beneath my feet. It wasn't the wind or the waves. It was like something had struck the hull from below. Hard. The boat lurched violently to port, sending my coffee flying and nearly knocking me off my feet. I bolted to the edge of the deck, peering into the dark water, but saw nothing. Just the inky black depths staring back at me. My mind raced. I'd encountered aggressive sharks before, but this didn't feel like a shark. Then, the sonar wailed again. Another blip. Identical in size to the first, directly beneath it. My stomach dropped. Whatever was down there wasn't alone. The second mass was rising just as fast. I stared at the monitor, my breath shallow and quick. The first blip was now only 1,500 feet below. The second, 1,800. They were coming up, and they were closing the distance fast. The radio crackled to life, spitting static. I hadn't touched it all night. Iron Minnow, this is Coast Guard Station Delta, over. The voice was faint, barely cutting through the interference. We're picking up a distress signal from your location. Are you? The boat rocked violently again, cutting the transmission short. This time, the impact was strong enough to split the air with the sound of groaning metal. My heart raced as I stumbled back toward the controls. The water around the boat was churning now, foaming and swirling as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. I leaned over the railing again, and for the first time, I saw it. A colossal, leathery fin breached the surface, slick and black as oil. It glistened in the moonlight for only a moment before sinking back beneath the waves. Then another fin, larger than the first, surfaced on the starboard side. Whatever this was, it was circling me. The sonar emitted a frantic series of beeps. A third blip appeared, smaller but moving erratically, zigzagging between the other two. The patterns didn't make sense. They weren't fish. They weren't whales. They were something else, something I didn't want to understand. A deep, guttural groan echoed through the hull, like the sound of distant thunder. It was coming from below, vibrating through my bones. I grabbed the radio. Mayday! This is the Iron Minnow! Something's down here with me. It's huge. The boat lurched violently to starboard, and I was thrown against the railing, the radio clattering to the deck. My ribs screamed in protest as I scrambled to my feet. The water was boiling now, and the fog thickened unnaturally, shrouding everything in a suffocating gray haze. The groan came again, louder this time, and I saw it, a massive shadow just beneath the surface. It moved like a living island, its edges undulating with impossible grace. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the shadow wasn't just one creature. It was two, moving in unison, their forms overlapping and merging like a terrible dance. The smaller the smaller creature, shot to the surface. It erupted from the water with a shriek that sent icy tendrils of fear down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Its body was serpentine, its skin pale and translucent, with rows of needle-like teeth that glinted in the moonlight. It thrashed wildly, as if in pain, before diving back beneath the waves. Then the larger ones surfaced. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Towering, jagged spines jutted from their backs, glistening with seawater and something darker, thicker. Their eyes, yellow and alien, glowed with a malevolent intelligence. One of them let out a deafening bellow, a sound that seemed to split the night apart. My ears rang, and my vision blurred. I stumbled back, fumbling for the radio. "It's coming up!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "It's coming!" The boat tilted sharply, and I fell hard onto the deck. A massive, tentacle-like appendage, slick and covered in bioluminescent patterns, slammed down onto the railing, crushing it like paper. Another tentacle followed, wrapping around the stern and pulling the boat downward. Water surged over the deck, and I fought to stay upright as the iron minnow groaned and shuddered. I could hear the hull cracking beneath me, the wood and metal splintering like dry twigs. The last thing I saw before the boat was dragged under was one of the creature's eyes, huge and unblinking, staring straight into mine. It wasn't just an animal. It knew me. It knew what I was. And then darkness. When they found the wreckage of the iron minnow weeks later, the hull was crushed as if by enormous hands. There was no sign of me, or the creatures. Just the mangled remains of the boat and a single, chilling message carved into the deck. "Leave."